thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you so much. We are meeting at a very ominous time, and um, I'll tell you the story behind today's talk. About a year and a half or 2 years ago, I was visiting West Coast, where Prasanna is based at, and he had a book that he was discussing with people, and he was very much drawn into that book that he ended up spending evening talking to me about the book, and almost he had those ideas on his tongue. He kept rehashing them, and I felt that he's quite driven by it. And so he had just come from a reading club where he had proposed this book to be read. And then I took it. The title was very interesting and very um, appealing to some of us who resist the idea of oppression. And then Prasanna, when was reading this book, which is how fascism um, operates, works, and destabilizes our world. Jason Stanley wrote that book. Prasanna kept on repeating some of the highlights and then draw that major pointers from the book to relate to what was happening in India. And there was this theoretical new reinvention we were trying to revisit, because oftentimes the text on fascism is either too thick, too dry, and often, it is a very difficult process to consume, especially within academic realm. And so here was a book which was very much accessible, and Prasanna and other people kept bringing that up to me. And then when I went to down in Sonoma Valley, I had discussed this book with friends, and so it happened that wherever I went, in fact, there was this book. And so we decided that, when we will host the Raosaheb Kasabe Distinguished Lecture. Now, Raosaheb is someone who had written about the RSS and fascism in the 1970s. And for that, he had received, obviously, death threats. He is a prominent Ambedkarite Dalit thinker of our times. He's now in his 80s. And when he was writing about it, he was really looking at the concepts of how fascism operates in a society in a vernacular realm. And here he was writing in Marathi. The book was entitled Zhot, Zhot, and I believe it's translated. But when the book came out, Kasbe became a sensation, and Kasbe has been from that time vociferously advocating against fascism. And so then we thought, if we have to convene a lecture on fascism, there's no better person than Jason Stanley. So I welcome you all. The conversation is being recorded, so we're gonna publish it by well curation. And we all know Jason Stanley has given the most important statement from academic world as a professor who has shown what it takes to be a courageous intellectual by giving up, relinquishing the coveted professorship at Yale, going down to Canada to take up a job at a public university where he will be now raising his children. And he has also indicated in his work that he doesn't want to raise his children through this. And I've spent the past weekend listening to his various presentations that he had on various TV, and as well as reading about him. Without further ado, Prasanna, why don't you take it ahead and be the chaperone of our conversation today?
Thank you, Dr. Youngday. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are from. My name is Prasanna. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Jason Stanley. I plan to introduce him now, but I don't know how relevant it is going to be the introduction given the changing times. Some of the introduction might seem uh, a thing of past in very real near present. So here it goes. Professor Jason Stanley is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. He's also a distinguished professor at the Kiev School of Economics. Before Yale, he has been at the other renowned universities such as Rutgers University, University of Michigan, and Cornell University. He earned his PhD in 1995 at the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT, and he has received his BA from the State University of New York at Stony Brook in 1990. He is a renowned author. He is author of 7 books: Knowledge and Practical Interest, How Propaganda Works, both of which have won prominent prizes; Language in Context, The Politics of Language, Know How, and the most recent book, Erasing History, How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. But the book, as Suraj just mentioned, that caught my attention was How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, is one of my favorite books and relevant for today's topic of discussion. It is a must read for a responsible citizen such as us, which provides the critical tools to recognize the difference between the legitimate tactics in liberal democratic politics and invidious tactics in fascist politics. Honored to have you, Professor Stanley, with us, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how fascism works in non Western countries. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and I'm really grateful to Dr. Yengda for inviting me, and of course to give a lecture in Raosaheb Kasabe's name. India has been central to my work on fascism. Both my books on fascism, How Fascism Works and Erasing History, use India as a primary example. The structure of India is somewhat different. No two fascist situations are the same. In India, you have uh, a long time structure of a caste system. Fascism in Western societies is based on race. There is, of course, now a lengthy 20th century and 21st century literature on the relationship between caste and race. But in a classic scapegoating fashion, following the theorist Rene Girard, India has used its Muslim minority as a way to bind together the different castes in support of what looks to be a campaign of ethnic cleansing that is either starting now or at least threatens. Rene Girard argued that a political community is created by a scapegoat, and you need to take an innocent scapegoat uh, and bind together otherwise different groups. So this is a different structure than in European fascism. We'd have to ask in other non-Western countries what the structure of fascism would look like. For example, in Kenya, with over 40 tribes, you just don't have the background structure that would allow for something that looked like fascism. Though you could easily have an authoritarian. We could ask whether Idi Amin, a dictator like Idi Amin, was a fascist. But again, Uganda has such a different structure, such a different base material structure, that it may be too complex to apply a a concept uh, like fascism. So why is India so central uh, when there are these differences? When you have caste, and when you have religion, and when you have uh, and when you have Muslim minority. India is different because the theorists of Hindu fascism, Savarkar and Golwalkar, explicitly took the Nazis as a justificatory model for targeting India's Muslim population. And the tactics that were used in Hindu nationalism, in the fascist parts of Hindu nationalism, of Hindutva, uh, mirror quite precisely the tenets of fascism, as far as the strategies and tenets of fascism, as I lay out in How Fascism Works. So, chapter one of that book, of my analysis, is called The Mythic Past. You draw on a mythic past to create this illusion of past purity. So, uh, obviously, Hindutva, by its claims of a pure Hindu past in India, is kind of a core example of the mythic past, saying we were pure and then we were invaded by Westerners and made impure. And the language of purity invites comparison of immigrants to termites, vermin, and disease, also familiar in contemporary politics in India. The mythic past also connects to another tactic of fascism, which I call sexual anxiety. And one of the primary examples I use is the love jihad discourse in India. Uh, I so Tara Gupta's work, a theorist of both fascism, Nazism, and uh, and Indian and Hindutva, uh, so she can really see these parallels. Has done work on both structures within National Socialism and contemporary India, and I use her work a lot. I've taught it. I taught it this semester. Uh, so, because I think she can see those parallels quite clearly, because she's working on Nazism as well. So what's the idea of the love jihad? Well, if you have an underlying structure of purity, if you have an underlying structure of a mythic past of purity, then you can create panic that a minority group is disturbing that purity, not just by entering the country, but by threatening women, the pure women. And this is classic. National Socialism said, according to the stab in the back myth of the Nazis, Jews were bringing in black Senegalese soldiers who would then rape Aryan women or just sleep with Aryan women to create non-white babies in Germany. So this structure of creating fear about your women is central to fascism. So it also, as the journalist Ida B. Wells lays out in 1892, it also is an attack on the women of the dominant group. So the love jihad is a straightforward attack, is an even more straightforward attack than the ideology and propaganda behind the mass lynching of Black American men. Why? Because it grants that Hindu women might fall in love with Muslims. And then it says that, oh no, they're actually being tricked. They're not, it's not agency. They have no agency. They are the property of Hindu men. And when they marry Muslims, they have been tricked because they can't make their own decisions. They are the property of Hindu men. The love jihad is so much more anti-Hindu. It targets 50% of the Hindu population. And it says women are the property of men. They cannot marry Muslims. Whenever they marry Muslims, it is not their own agency, and they must be saved from that. It's harsher than the ideology behind lynching, because the thought behind lynching was that Black men were raping white women. So, here it's saying that even when they marry them, even when Hindu women marry Muslim men, they're not agents because they're like objects. They're owned by Hindu men. So these parallels, the idea that immigrants are a kind of infestation, a violation of purity. These are all characteristic marks of fascism. And then you have I was arguing recently with a brilliant scholar of India, Maya Jasanoff, and she was sort of denying. She was like, "Oh well, it's not fascism here." And then I'm like, "It's a global fight. Do you think it's fascism in India?" And she's like, "Oh, well, of course, of course that, so, it's a global fight. Trump and Modi, Netanyahu, Putin, these are, or Ban, these are linked figures using similar strategies. But in India, we have a more explicit case. We have, Hitler is not represented as the worst man in history. Hitler is, in the popular culture in India, a conqueror. So fascism does not have, as it were, the bad rep that it has in the West, and that's something that makes it an even more concerning situation. So we can see the attack on Muslims, on non-Hindus, partly as a method of scapegoating to bring different Hindu castes together. And this is exactly, as it were, out of the play. So we can see in India the another tactic of fascism that I call anti-intellectualism. So attacks on universities, representing universities as anti-national, as seditious, representing student protests as anti-national sedition. The idea is you take critical intellectual inquiry and you represent it as an attack on the nation. Because in fact, the history of India is much more complex. It is not a history of a pure Hindu past. And Hinduism is itself a complex religion that is not easily fit into Aryan supremacy, something like supremacy. So how does the form of anti-intellectualism take? Now, what I do in my work and my activism is I draw parallels between what is happening in other democratically backsliding countries, in other regimes, trans-fascism, and I say, look at the similarity. And India is something of a pioneer in these techniques. So the targeting of political opponents, obviously, the so now what there are very clear borrowings in the United States from Viktor Orban's authoritarianism in Hungary. For example, Viktor Orban targeted Central European University and used the accreditation system to make it impossible to accredit students. So Central European University had to move to Vienna. We can see very similar tactics in the United States. Columbia being the target, although they just are going after Harvard for $9 billion, which seems to me a lot of money. So the attacks on universities. India also, so now Orban very clearly appears in America, is a hero, is advising the MAGA movement in the United States. And I haven't been able to find evidence that Modi is doing something similar. Hold on for a moment. But it's inarguable that the tactics we saw in India, for example, in the reaction to the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2018, are being followed almost, point by point by the Trump administration. Anyone familiar with 2019 in India, with what they did to JNU, for example, the police coming onto campus, going after protesters, the representations in the media. We see the New York Times attacking universities again and again for being anti-national, for having protests against Israel, even when there are Jewish students deeply involved in these protests. And the media in the United States, like the New York Times op-ed page, has attacked universities relentlessly for 10 years, essentially for not being patriotic, for centering Black history, for criticizing scientific racism. So we have a dramatic. So I think you see something similar in the press in India, and you saw something similar in the press in 2019. These justifications of the representations of the universities as anti-national. But in India at the time, you had those media outlets essentially, there's good reason to believe. I suspect there was government pressure. There was part of a campaign. Whereas in the United States, you have universities being attacked by the media for a decade with no with no government involvement. The media has willingly played the role of laying the path for attacking universities. So the New York Times op-ed page has been concerned trolling about leftists on campus for a decade or more, a decade. So even today, even in the last week, they published yet another concern trolling piece about leftists on campus. They're devoted to helping the Trump administration's attack on universities. So let's go back to 2019 and the Citizenship Amendment Act. We have the media attacking universities. We have the representation of students protesting laws that create tiers of citizenship, the hallmark of fascism, between Hindus and Muslims. And we have students where, as we've seen from Bangladesh, are the source of resistance to authoritarianism. The students in Bangladesh having overturned that Sheikh Hasina's government. So you have professors targeted, like when Pratap Mehta was cast out of Ashoka University and told that they could not defend him. Pratap Mehta is no radical. He's a liberal. He's a liberal political theorist. So you have this sort of random targeting of prominent academics. Columbia did this with Catherine Frank. They forced her into retirement for comments she made on Democracy Now, which supposedly made Jewish students feel unsafe at Columbia. And she, like Pratap Mehta, is a professor that any university should be proud to employ. Of course, Pratap Mehta was immediately hired at Princeton University as a distinguished visiting professor. And yet, he cannot go back to an Indian university. So this targeting of prominent intellectuals, the revision of history and perspectives, we see this in the United States. Surely one of the greatest, a handful of the greatest writers of the last century, even certainly the last 50 years, is Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison. Instead of expressing pride about her about such a great thinker and writer, her works have been banned because they represent a perspective on the United States that does not extol the white majority. We find similar revisions of history in the BJP textbooks that are now promulgated throughout India. We find an attack on India's secular democracy. We find subtle revisions of the history to represent the father of Indian democracy, Mahatma Gandhi, as a traitor. One textbook I talk about in my book, Erasing History, says that one of Gandhi's central goals was getting India to pay reparations to Pakistan. Now, if you think about that, what they're saying there is Gandhi was a traitor. So this revision of history, the minimization of Muslim Muslim leaders in India and Muslim periods in India's history is central to a fascist movement. The erasure of paths of minority groups and the elevation of the dominant group as the identity of the nation. India's attacks on universities have gone further went further in 2019 than what we're seeing in America, but we are quickly catching up. The organizers of some of the central organizers of the 2019 anti-CAA Davin Gana Kalita and Natasha Narval, who Pindra Todd, the Me Too organization that was involved, that helped organize the anti-CAA protests, were accused of sedition. We see that already in the United States when students are being hauled off the street and for co-authoring op-eds in student newspapers and dragged to brutal prisons in Louisiana. Is this imitation of India 6 years later? Well, certainly India pioneered these fascist tactics of painting opposition, of painting critical voices as traitors. So let's turn to the topic of resistance. And again, I want to turn here to Bangladesh, where the students led the resistance. we can see the centrality of students, and they too, those who seek to dismantle democracy, can see the centrality of students, the centrality of universities. It is essential that universities hold their ground, because these hollow democratic institutions have within them the people who, students, young students, who cherish freedom and are willing to act on that. So we have to look to India for the kind of resistance that Bangladesh provided. And we have to respond to the tactic of scapegoating. We must recognize that there are many oppressed groups in India, and the solidarity has to be between those oppressed to divide people who otherwise should be connected. So we see in India, many interviews recently. So we see in India. So what is Du Bois's analysis? Du Bois says that poor whites and poor blacks were unifying together in a labor movement because they collectively recognized the similarity of their oppression. And so the northern industrialists and the southern planter class then used race as a way to divide people who should otherwise have been. So they told essentially poor whites, we are all white. So you are at least white. You might not have any money. We might be treating you like trash, but at least you are white. That's how race works, states. That's how the fascist regime of Jim Crow in the South worked. It drew poor whites into that fascist regime by telling them, oh, well, we're going to keep on having you, do the manual labor for wealthy whites, but at least you. When challenging scapegoating as a tactic, it is essential to emphasize the similarity in material conditions groups. The targets of fascism are minority groups, intellectuals, the media, the universities, and women's rights, because the idea is to target to say that the dominant group must reproduce, because the only people in the nation should be the dominant group, and non-dominant members of the non-dominant communities are always invaders. The concern that many of us have about what is happening in India today is that the basis is being laid for anything from ethnic cleansing, genocide. I've been worried about India. My book, How Fascism Works, is 2018, and India is a principal example, because we see the rhetoric laying the basis. We see the legal system. We see what looks to be something like the Nuremberg laws that took citizenship from my father in Berlin. We see a structure between the National Registry and the Citizenship Amendment Act that threatens to remove the citizenship of many, many Indians. And then when you criticize that, you are told, oh, we're helping immigrants. We're allowing non-Muslim immigrants to come in. So like Jim Crow, it uses these facially neutral methods to remove the citizenship of a large population of Indians. We already see that non-Hindu citizens of India are being treated like second-class citizens, arrested and being prepared for mass deportation. So somehow the structure of Indian democracy is held in certain places, probably because the federalist structure of India, the different states, have resistance and power. That structure is a model for other backsliding democracies, because so far, though there are regular lynchings of non-Hindus, you have not cross the path. The experiment in Assam of grand concentration camps to collect the people whose citizenship and heritage in India has been removed because they lack the proper documentation. Those vast deportation centers, unlike in the United States, are not yet full. But as you see in the United States, the language that we had in the first Trump administration is now being transformed into policy. My concern with India is that something soon is that we're seeing that process. It's been slowed somewhat for reasons that we can discuss and should discuss. The federalism struggle, the states, but you have the rhetoric, and like in the United States, it could soon turn into policy. Some of this you beat us to, like the structure of the attack on universities in the United States looks like it mirrors what happened in 2019. So it mirrors so closely what happened in 2019. It's kind of in India. It's kind of spooky, so I am curious about the tactics of resistance and what's happening in Indian University. And here we come to a kind of central question I have, which is: are these tactics kind of universal? Is it just natural to follow these tactics? There seems to be a playbook. As I said, when we look at other non-Western countries and Africa, this is an old debate in African philosophy. Senghor on African socialism, for example, where you ask whether the material conditions in a non-Western country are similar enough to a Western country to apply concepts. I think in India, despite its bewildering variety of groups and languages, the scapegoating mechanisms of Hindu nationalism have allowed India to create something like a European fascist structure. Modi himself is a kind of cultish leader, a different structure. It doesn't exactly look like Mussolini, doesn't exactly look like Hitler, but he does have a kind of almost religious cult around him. He is the leader in the European fascist sense. It's not a structure like Jim Crow that was leaderless. There is a leader here. So we have something, and then finally we have an explicit history of Hindutva acknowledging influence and justification from Nazi Germany. Thank you.
This is excellent. Bravo. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us so many things to share. What we can do is, obviously, we'll invite people to comment with their questions. But
hold on, Suraj, I'm going to get some water quickly.
Oh, you do you. That's fine.
Back.
Back. There we go. Thank you. What I can do is, so please, yeah. So you, whoever has any questions, you have to type them. We may not be able to. We may not be able to show. We give you this. Let me just fix. All right. So one of the things, Jason, you talk about in this text, and there's so much to chew on, right? I mean, and the various contents of fascism, the way you describe, work in a way that that tells us the recipe. The hierarchy is one of this, and of course, you cite the work of Jim Sidanius. You start with Max Weber, for example, to look at how hierarchy kind of manifests itself. And obviously, there are few things that really connect to understanding fascism. Now, it's interesting that a leading theorist of our times on fascism, who wrote this book in 2018, it was not like something Trump 2.0 came or whatever. This is something that's been thinking, and you yourself, your own familial history has had a strong brush of fascism down in Berlin, where you talk about, and now almost 100 years later, we are revisiting some of this. Now, one of the things I see, is somehow fascism seems to operate in a under the democratic promise. It's like, you start with coalition governments. Hitler did that and so forth, and then you go into a single party, and then you become authoritarian. So somehow it feels like the classic old example of how democracy or liberal democracy gives rise to fascist impulses, because there are many more unaddressed issues that otherwise a socialist democracy or a communist government, would not allow. So I think one of the things is to think about, because like Modi, Trump, very astute observation, and many of us who are observing this closely, at least since 2014, it doesn't seem chilling, because we have seen that, right? Looking over the shoulders and how it was followed. And that's what is happening. Especially taking over the party as becoming cultish figure. And we see that's happening, right? I mean, President Trump, he's one of the congressperson had proposed amendment to have him run for the third term as well, right? And you see this loyalist kind of taking over party politics. And in the kind of question I have for you is as follows, right? What is democracy really doing here? I mean, democracy not just a freedoms of liberalisms of sorts, freedom of expression and liberties and so forth, but also electoral democracy. Is it a really a petri dish, or is it really an experimental spaceship for us to think about fascism taking root somewhere here? That's question one. The second question is, the way you pointed out, and I was reading a piece yesterday in Guardian where they say the Me Too movement, for example, the way it exacerbated and created so many things, and some of the response to that was now a strong Andrew Tate like people, who are been accosted by the FBI a director and different people. So what we see, so what I'm trying to draw attention to is perhaps, I mean, this is what the article was looking at. Are there some cultural elements of this politics that somehow is not a complete, it does not cover majority, because Me Too was also included men, but that respect of men victims, and somehow then you immediately create, okay, this doesn't address me. I don't believe in right wing authoritarianism. So I kind of so that's a little question. And the third question, very quickly, because in for India, we at least have this people, at least is a very bad word to use. We have somebody who we can point out finger to as to who are articulators of this fascism. What is it in America? What's happening? So three questions to you. Democracy, is it a recipe? Cultural fragments, are they creating this kind of things? And the theorist of America. And then we'll take.
You are on mute.
Democracy leads to tyranny, question one. Then what is the route from democracy to tyranny? That's right, Suraj, right?
That's right.
The second question is about patriarchy. Is that right?
Or culture in any sense.
Backlash.
Backlash, yeah, the kind of progressive policies, so to speak, or whatever,
Backlash to Black Lives Matter and Me Too.
exactly. Example are.
Yeah. And let's get to the third question in a minute. You might have to repeat that because I'm thinking about the first two. Democracy. Your first question pertains, as you probably know, to the oldest discussion as democratic political theory. In Book 8 of Plato's Republic, he has a pretty watertight argument that democracy inevitably leads to tyranny. And I think we're seeing that play out everywhere. So, how does Plato's argument work? Democracy has as its central value a freedom, liberty. And so anyone can run for office. Anyone can run for leadership in a democracy. What does that mean? That means, then Plato says, that means the people who really shouldn't be leaders will run. The people who are most unsuited to be leaders. And how will they? Because they want power. That's why in Plato's Callipolis, the leaders don't want power. They're just they want wisdom. So I'm not recommending Plato's authoritarian society, though it would put me in charge, but also I wouldn't be allowed to have any money or private property. Uh, so, but Plato says that democracy points out democracy has liberty as its central value. This allows anyone to run for office. Who will run for office? The power hungry people who should not be leaders. How will they run for office? They'll divide the people, they'll scapegoat. They'll create an internal enemy. They'll unify the dominant group against the internal enemy. Then they'll seize power, promising to protect the dominant group from the internal enemy, from enemies internal and external. And then they will transform into tyrants. You know, this is a very good argument, like many but not all of Plato's arguments. And we are seeing it repeat, you know, exactly. So the idea, and then democratic political theorists, the first theorist of democracy, modern of democracy, Rousseau, says, okay, people say this system is impossible because someone will just exploit the people's resentments. How do you unify? How do you unify the? How do you unify? Dalits and Brahmins. So you unify them against Muslims. So this is a so this is a strategy that it just was laid out in the first philosophical discussion of democracy. How does Rousseau? So Rousseau says, in order to deal with this, in order to make sure that people don't have these resentments that can be exploited, you can't have inequality. Once you have large inequality, people will be filled with resentments that you could then exploit. All of this is what we are seeing now. Um, so, and it's no surprise because Plato was a smart guy and Rousseau was a smart guy. No democratic political theorist ever has said that democracy would be possible in conditions of stark social and economic inequality. So if we didn't have this collapse of democracy, then 2,000 years of democratic political philosophy would have been disproven. But instead, we're seeing exactly what 2,000 years of democratic political philosophy would have predicted: the rise of tyrants in democracy. Second question: backlashes to progressive movements. Obviously, in the United States, we're seeing a backlash. I can't speak to the structure of backlash in India. I mean, except in very general ways that it seems to be a backlash to liberalism. So, uh, so so we have, which is the core value of India's secular democracy, and why Gandhi is so famous worldwide. Uh, so, uh, so, so we definitely have backlash to a very strong backlash. We have, extreme backlash. Obviously, there were excesses of Me Too targeting people who, we all know that social movements can have accesses when they make a point. Black Lives Matter, same thing. Professors or teachers targeted for, I mean, uh, you targeted for their speech, misinterpretations of people, over overgeneralizations of racist behavior. And there are some racists. There's always going to be racists, but you can't exclude them from culture. You just have to deal with that in a democracy. All of us have people in our families who have different views than we do, and that we would characterize as racist or sexist. That's what a family is, and a nation, a democratic nation, is something like a big family. But we have very stark um, we have very stark backlashes. The United States, the historian Elizabeth Hinton has this concept she calls the cycle. And she shows in her book, America on Fire, that you have American history is characterized by, since the 1960s, but even in small cities, by police violence against Black people, a black revolution, then the white people who run the place say, okay, we will change things, and then everybody agrees that structures will be changed, and then there's a white backlash, and it makes things worse than ever. So that cycle structure is, I suspect, not just in the United States, and it's not just with race. So so I suspect it's operative in the Me Too case as well, and it explains why, and then what happens is you get one political party that's allowed all the sexual harassment it wants, and the other political party is constrained by the progressive ideals, and so sometimes overly constrained. So it's kind of an uneven battlefield. Same with speaking the truth. One political party is constrained to speak the truth, and the other political party can say whatever it wants. So how do you fight that when you can't really engage in the tactics of the other party, because your party stands for truth, your party stands for women's equality, racial equality, things like that. But you're fighting an uneven fight then, because they can use anti-democratic tactics. So what you have to rely on is a population who values democracy and democratic values. And that's going to be hard when there's a progressive movement that challenges long-standing structures. So because people will feel it's an attack on their traditions and way of life, especially when there are excesses and overreaches that uh, uh, that that make people panic that if they say something racist, they'll be lose their jobs or something. So ironically, now people are panicked that they'll lose their jobs if they express any pro-Palestinian sentiment, and and they're being attacked by the very same group that's reacting to the excesses, to some of the excesses of Me Too and Black Lives Matter. But they're doing the same thing, but they really are firing people and they really are incarcerating people. So and justifying it by saying, okay, you did these excessive things. So even though they're nowhere near state imposed excessive things. So what was the third question?
Who do you can point as a theorist of fascism in America? Is there one person, Project 25, or collective? Can you, in your research, did you come across?
Great. So the question is, who are the intellectuals now? And I think we do have I think J.D. Vance is an intellectual behind, underestimating J.D. Vance. Watching the Democrats taunt J.D. Vance was a terrible mistake before the vice presidential debate, because obviously J.D. Vance is more of an intellectual than than the Democratic vice presidential candidate. So I think you can see he has a hardcore fascist intellectual framework, targeting opponents, no mercy, and a justification for that. It's kind of Christian nationalist fascism we are seeing. The Claremont Institute is an institute that is structured as the intellectual home of Trumpism. And Christopher Rufo must be mentioned. I've long, studied, seen what he's doing. He's an extraordinary propagandist, and he is laying the basis for the destruction of the schools and universities, and was the tactician in Florida behind the destruction of the schools and universities, and is the tactician for the Trump administration.
I think, thank you for that. I think, I spent some time, the same, I think you just did with op doc with New York Times, Ross Douthat.
I mean, I haven't. Ross Douthat is a brilliant theorist, but he's also a friend of mine. So our kids are, our kid, so, and I think he is a great mind of this movement that we see. I think he's a critic of its excesses, uh, you know, but he's also a normalizer of these excesses. He also, he normalizes natalism, which is, the dominant group. If you have natalism plus panic about immigration, then what you're saying is that the dominant group should have a lot of babies. And so I think ideologically, either Ross does not accept that that is fascism, or because I think those are his views. I think he's probably I mean, I've never heard him say this, but I think he's probably much more sympathetic to great replacement theory than he should be. And the natalism is part of that.
And I think that really, because what he did was the way you were observing Rufo. I mean, he did a couple of op docs with Steve Bannon, and he did with Rufo, and I was into both of them. It was long, hour and a half kind of thing. Some of the points they make are not really totally outrageous. You can listen to them and to say, okay, this kind of point that they are making, of the 100 questions, 95 were responded in a very sluggish kind of manner. But there were 5 questions, let's say, that were taken up with. And same with, I was in Appalachia region just a couple of weeks ago, and I could see that the kind of this, the appeal that people have for the strong man, and this kind of neglected kind of, minority kind of groups. But what we see, Jason, in this case, in India, for example, there is a Muslim scapegoating because Muslim as an other is very visible, is palpable, because Muslim have a different tradition, they have a different physical appearance. A Muslim can practice Islam by appearing not similar to, let's say, any other, because it's distinguishable factor. Now there are some indistinguishable factor, yet they are very vastly different. For example, the culture of tribal people or the Dalits in India, they don't sit at all. I mean, there is no meeting point of the Brahmanical Hindu culture with these cultures, and yet somehow the Muslim as an exterior, physically distant appearing culture becomes the kind of a moment of target. In this instance, in America or in Western democracy, who do you think are these visible scapegoats? But in fact, the victims are. I mean, fascism really is not against Muslims only. Muslims are one object, and as we know, the students of fascism, it impacts like Roma people, what they did, or the. So what's happened? So who is now that scapegoat, and who are also the victims with that outcome?
Well, Palestinians seem to be playing that role. And despite the fact that there aren't many Palestinians, trans people are
Exactly.
certainly playing that role.
Mhm.
It's astonishing to me how many Americans, despite the 5 trans people there are in America,
Exactly. Exactly.
just regard this as a reason to vote for fascism. So trans people are, and the expression LGBTQ is just like the expression people of color is really problematic here, because obviously uh, there are members of the LGBTQ community. Richard Grenell is a central member of this fascist movement, and he's gay. So he's a gay man. So Alice Weidel, the head of Alternative for Deutschland,
Exactly.
is lesbian.
And
So
she is also a mixed child, right? Like sort of.
yes, Indian, I believe. But in America, you can see Asians are being treated as white by this administration. So the new target of civil rights actions, the focus, as Linda McMahon said, of civil rights legislation is going to be uh, anti-white and anti-Asian discrimination.
Mm.
So, so it is Black people who are being singled out by the campaign against DEI. What the campaign against DEI is a campaign against Black people in positions of power. So, there are women who are examples, but I've yet to find, other than Kamala Harris, who I think is was attacked for being Black and not for being Asian. I cannot find any Asian targets of, and of course, the Civil Rights Administration, we're being told that they're going to target universities for anti-white and anti-Asian discrimination. So obviously, because the attack on trans people has brought some black men into the Trumpist fold, and the manosphere, the patriarchy, but black people are very clearly the targets, I think. And leftists are the targets. Anyone who's a critic of the war in Gaza, Israel's war in Gaza, is suddenly an anti-Semite. But the panic is about immigrants, always immigrants, xenophobia. The panic is about an attack on white supremacy. We've seen the history. We've seen the history. The attack on history. So we're going to go back to Confederate monuments and things like that.
Thank you. And I'll take some of the questions, and also you kind of touch upon some of them as we were speaking, especially on the question of, immigrants. And one of the questions I asked is, and I'll try to kind of summarize them, a few of them into one, where the immigration that happens, one is working class immigration, and the other immigration is of the social elites who migrate. And Trump is somebody who is advocating for that. You pay, I don't know, $4 million or something, and you get yourself this. So to kind of three questions you can answer in your short time that you have. Jeremy, Nicole, Pari, and few of them have asked in different sense is to, like, for example, Jeremy is asking, can you speak about local resistance, devoid of shifting to Canadian University? What can local universities do to push against the culture of fear? And I think that's the same question about, is there a step? So that's the kind of first question. The second question is, what Pari is interestingly asking is, how long might this take to see, like, is this a sign of US the empire being, is it crumbled? Is it crumbling? And do you predict that? And finally, Nicole's question is, what tends to cause the supporters of fascist leader to change their mind? Do they change their mind? So what is it? Is it something that we need to do? Or does the inequality blow up itself? It's so measured that there is a revolution.
Can I add one question to that as well, Professor? I think most of the audience are also looking at the solution part of it. In your book, you mention about empathy. You mention in your talk, you mentioned about solidifying solidarity, finding these material conditions that are common to these people. But what other mechanisms can we look at to counter these fascist elements and tactics? So I think that you could end with that.
Bonds to respond to government.
Should.
Yes, fantastic. First university to make. Other universities must follow suit. It is the time to use our endowments, or else we're not going to survive as institutions. We'll just survive as hedge funds or something. So you've got to use your endowment now. Princeton's professor, Princeton's president looks like he's modeling leadership right now. So we don't have protests. The spontaneous protests we're seeing are helpful, but we don't have the giant demonstrations that Germany has every time Alternative for Deutschland shows up. Somehow we're going to have to get Americans to understand. I mean, I think the administration is using fear, certain tactics to uh, certain tactics to create fear, and there might be a backlash to that. There might be a backlash to, for example, the video about the poor Tufts student being arrested on the street, and then the White House then publishing a cartoon that they say was tongue-in-cheek or something. They said was someone different, of a Muslim woman being handcuffed, and they claimed this was like a Muslim woman smuggling fentanyl, because of course Muslims smuggle fentanyl. Is absurdity, but that's the propaganda we're supposed to accept. So people might react to that, but I think what we're seeing is an attack on the democratic institutions, and the democratic institutions it'll go a long way if you just do your job. If you just do your job, and of course, speaking out. Like I try to speak out very loudly and clearly to allow other people to speak out. And the action I did of moving to Toronto is a political action. It's meant to say, when I write things, they're like, my point is shit is bad. But moving really communicates that.
We got five more. We got five. Mhm.
Education is vital, of course. That's why they're attacking education.
And I think this is what Dr. Rakesh has asked also. I mean, in India there is a level of illiteracy that we have, kind of exorbitant, and then the syllabus that we have is very right-oriented, nationalist. So it doesn't really give us this liberty of thought and kind of multiple perspectives. So he's curious about have you come across any syllabus here that may do. And also, can you tell? I mean, do you see this as a breakdown of this global order, Steve Bannon's dream?
Oh, right. Well, this is an attack. It's hard not to see this as just an attack on the United States. They're dismantling the United States and making us into a pariah nation. So why do that? You could have all sorts of conspiracy theories about why they're trying to make us a pariah nation. They're explicitly like, we're great because we can punch you in the nose and kick your ass. But nobody likes a bully. Like,
Right.
why do they think anyone will like the United States if we're a bully? But that's what we're doing. And it's hard to see that in any other way as an attack on my country.
That's right.
Modi is not doing that part of what's going on.
That's right.
He's not humiliating India on the international stage by being like, we're the biggest and we'll crush you. He isn't doing that. He's hiding what's happening in India by saying we're a democracy, believing in equality. Whereas Trump is like, I'm going to crush my political opponents. I'm going to conquer. I'm going to take over other countries. I'm going to kick your ass. I'm going to punish you, and we're going to rule, which is much more openly Nazi and openly just utterly destructive of the soft power of the United States. Why make the United States a pariah nation if you're not a traitor?
That is. So the final question before you depart is very interesting. Pratap Mehta, for example, the question is, they advocated for a strongman like Modi from the liberal position, and then they got the heat back, and then they left to the West. What about those people? Like, how do we profile individuals such as this who don't see or foresee such kind of anathema or mayhem being caused in near future?
Oh, you mean driving intellectuals out?
Yeah, I mean, no. Pratap Mehta was somebody who was advocating for Modi, and
Oh, right.
before he became, and in a way, he didn't advocate for Modi in the sense of like outright, but then he was pointing out the fault lines also of Congress. But he did see merits in Modi's leadership. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, Trump made good points in his first campaign against entrenched corruption in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The system was broken. It did need to be overturned. We did need something new. But moments of liberation, fascism is also an ethic. Fascism is also a revolution. It's a counter-revolution, but it's also a revolution. So, there's this, those of us who were like, those of us who said there's long been a conflict on the American left. And the conflict is people read me as justifying the status quo because I was saying this is fascism. We all have to unify against it. But like in Germany in the late 20s and the early 30s, the left split, and a lot of people were attacked people like me more than they attacked the Trumpists on the left because they said you're trying to say they're fascists, so we should go back to neoliberalism. So I think that was totally wrong. As we're now seeing, this is fascism. Those people helped elect Trump by depressing the vote. They had a point, as Trump had a point, that the neoliberal system must go. but is responsible for the inequality that undermines democracy. But if it comes at the cost of fascism, that's too much.
This has been amazing. I invite Prasanna to offer his concluding remarks before we bid goodbye to everyone.
Well, this has been, as always, like your book, an insightful session. Thank you for joining with us today. I thank Suraj for also organizing such an event, and on behalf of Painfully Foundation. We touched upon a lot of tactics that you mentioned in the books, going from mythic past, sexual anxiety, anti intellectualism, and hierarchy. And there are many more that we need to look into. As you said, one of the intentions of yours to write this book was to provide the citizens with critical tools to recognize the difference, right, between the legitimate tactics and one of the solutions you have also mentioned is about how to have this empathy between these oppressed groups in which the fascist elements try to create division and try to dehumanize. And so I think there are things for us to look for. Being vigilant to these tactics is equally important. I have already shared the book in the chat. Audience can go through the book. It is very insightful. It helps you see the historical moments as they are happening with these tactics. So, to awareness, and we thank you for joining us once again. We wish you good luck. Thank you for standing up and making taking a stance and showing us a way to resist these kind of elements. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. It's an honor to give this lecture. I dropped my latest book on fascism into the chat as well. There's a lot on India. I hired someone to look at the BJP textbooks.
And
So
we'll be sure to share with all the mail groups who have signed up. So thank you, Professor.
thank you so much. And yeah, all right.
Take care.